Welcome to E Squared Emporium, all things AP Psychology. Today, we're going to be looking at the introduction to this whole story called psychology. So, what is psychology? Well, it went from this philosophy, then blending with biology. It had to become a science for it to actually work out. So, it is a scientific study of behavior. Human action, thoughts are included in this, emotions are included in this. And of course, we're looking specifically at mental processes, and that's what we call cognition. So we say thinking, cognition is to think, but it includes, again, emotions. So they study both animal and human behavior. You'll see quite a few studies that are animal based studies, and from that we assume that this transfers to human behavior. Now, why should we study this? There's obviously a big question. You're in the class, you're looking at this, you're going, okay, so I've heard it's kind of cool, but why am I actually studying this? Well, you learn to really, hopefully, get a glimpse, I can't say understand, but get a glimpse into who you are. And by starting to see who you are, you're going to become less isolated psychologically, and therefore you will be less judgmental about others. You won't think of yourself in a non-normal way, because you're going to understand that most people have all kinds of things going on. And again, we're not just, as that last line tells us, if we're children viewed as, these beasts or creatures that need to be tamed. That's one viewpoint, okay, that, human beings are born sort of off the rails, and we need to be brought back, with taming techniques back into the rails. So, on the other hand, and there are tabula rasa theories, which is that it's blank slate and that you can be molded into anything. And then other people say we actually are born really good. We have a good nature, and it's experiences that kind of corrupt us. And again, all viable ways to look at the human condition. You learn to expand your mind. You'd be surprised how many times throughout this journey called psychology you're going to say, oh, well, I just did not see it this way, or I never looked at it from that angle, and this has expanded my horizons. All right, so we begin 1879, Wilhelm Wundt, Germany. And he creates what is known as the first psychology experiment, labeled psychophysics. He had the first psychology lab. And you see in that picture that it's a pretty rudimentary setup on a table. And what he was looking for is this thing we call mental processes, which then became known as cognition. And basically, the machine was designed that when a ball was dropped and hit a platform, you had to push a telegraph key. And that time lag in between hearing it and pushing the button, that's what we then call the mental process or cognition. Since this could be repeated over and over, this became the first psychology experiment. And what he found, that he could get all the way to 1/10 of a second. That's pretty fast. And then, of course, he started to, and this happens quite often, is that somebody takes a base experiment and then adds some new variable to it. And he did that as well, things to confound. So now, when asked to perceive different sounds, okay, we get a different response time. Again, different mental processing time. And he is what is known as a structuralist. This means that he's looking at the structure of something, and think about it this way. The structure of something is like a recipe where we need 2 eggs, a tablespoon of oil, and X amount of butter, and X amount of flour. Those are all of the pieces to make something that hopefully tastes good, right? And that's what we call the structure or structuralism. So for him, this would have been the ball dropping. That's one thing. The telegraph key pushing is another thing. The perception, the hearing, that's another piece. So he wanted to study all the parts. But as you can see on this graph, that wouldn't be enough to call this psychology. I mean, yes, you have to start somewhere, but the pieces always fit together somehow. Otherwise, it doesn't work. If you put the oil in after the whole thing has baked, it's going to be terrible. If you put the oil in and nothing else, bake the oil, you basically heat it up and then start throwing flour on it, that'd be gross. So functionalism basically means that things fit together in a very specific way. They have a function to fit together. So structuralism, parts, functionalism, how they fit together. If you think of a jigsaw puzzle, the pieces only fit together a certain way unless you're going to beat them in there with a mallet. Okay? There's only one piece that goes in one specific place a certain way. So then we get a new name, William James, who said, hey, we have functionalism. And he came from the religious side, not so much church or anything, but he was interested in religion. And for him, this is what he used to start to put this together, that, hey, pieces do fit together. So smelling is what the nose does, thinking is what the brain does, and now we start to look at how all of this, and we still do this today. We're still obviously looking when somebody has something going on. You go to the doctor, they take a scan, and they want to know which part of the brain, which affects whatever is happening. Is there something wrong with that part of the brain, and can we treat that? You should know, from your prior studies, the name Darwin and evolution. That's a big background, operating sort of in stealth mode program in psychology. The human system, especially the brain, is designed to survive. That's what it forces initially for us to do, and therefore we're going to have a lot of theories that at the end of the day, when you say, hey, wow, that theory really kind of proves the point that we are designed to survive, well, there you go. So 1960s up to today, we call the modern years of psychology. And you start to see that with the invention of new tech, new tests, new research, new drugs, and new theories, we can start to get into a new version of psychology. One of the big debates in psychology is the nature versus nurture debate. Okay? So nature means that you're born that way and it unfolds. We would look in neuroscience at a lot of genetics, DNA. Okay, so there is predetermined, meaning it's going to happen no matter what, and predisposition might be that you have the genetic possibility, but it takes some sort of environmental moment for it to actually happen. Some, let's say, trauma that forces it to activate. It's not going to happen, but it could happen. The nurture side says that it's all based on experience and the environment itself, and that you're not born that way. So if we were to say nurture only, then that's the blank slate or tabula rasa argument, right? It's saying that you come in with nothing and you are a product of all of your experiences. Nature only says that whatever is in your programming is going to unfold no matter what the life experience. So if you're meant to be a nice person by nature, then no matter how bad your childhood is, you're still going to be a nice person. Or, and this is where we start to get further into this, we start to look at the idea that it is nature via nurture, which means by way of. So nature starts to unfold by way of all of your experiences. So, great people that have done great things, they might have been born with the gift, but it took hard work to still make it happen. Yes, things come easy, but they still have to work at this. Life experience does the rest. Okay, are there limitations, for example? I mean, are some of us simply born with limitations that we cannot exceed? Okay, that would be the nature side of the equation. Big debate number 2 is continuity versus discontinuity. So, let's say you are person A, right? And that's your name that you're given at birth, and that's your personality. Does that stay with you throughout your life? That will be continuity. Like a version of you is always there, no matter what age you are. Discontinuity says that we go through stages and you're uniquely different. I mean, you might carry just a tiny little bit, but so again, some people are going to make the argument that they're separate things. Some people are going to make the argument that they go together and they operate hand in hand. These are the debates that you need to know. So it's nature versus or via nurture, and continuity versus discontinuity. Okay, then we get into the biopsychosocial model. This says that it is biology plus psychology plus biology that we need to put together. So this is another version of how we unfold as human beings, and it's all three of these. So it's not just two, it's three. The biology is the physiology, the human body. Okay, so anything that's in our physical side. The psychological, this is the stuff that you have learned, picked up along the way. Let's say it's a fear, let's say it's an emotional response, right, or a certain way of thinking about things. Social, this is now how the environment comes into play and how it affects you. And all three of those interact. The next component is that there are 6 current or major schools of psychology called perspectives or schools. They all obviously understand the other ones are there, but they think of themselves as the primary explanation for why we are the way that we are. The biological perspective says that there's the neuroscience, the evolutionary perspective, genetics. If we added surgery, psychosurgery in there, something that's going to be on the biological side, and that is the predominant reason why we are who we are. The psychodynamic, that's Freud, psychoanalysis, psychodynamic, we'll talk about that down the road. Same thing in terms of basically we have some sort of childhood trauma, some unresolved childhood issue that as we get older is always there and forces us to make decisions based on that filter. So again, we're going to study this in depth a little bit further, but the idea is, let's say you had a tough childhood, you were abused as a child. As you get older, you're going to use that as your filter to see the world. So things are going to be scary. Things are going to be non-trustworthy. Okay, humanism then was a reaction to the Freudian psychodynamic model. And it says, hey, there's a whole lot more to you. This is where we get into self-love. This is where we get into self-actualization, self-realization. Then comes the fourth perspective, behaviorism. This is where the environment is controlled. Remember the nature-nurture we just talked about? This is the nurture side. That means if, let's say, you're misbehaving, it is an environmental place or perspective from which we can actually address you. So a punishment might work, a reward might work, something along those lines where the environment controls the way that we are and behave. The cognitive perspective says that we think. So if something is wrong, let's say you suffer from a self-doubt, let's just keep it there, and you on a daily basis doubt your own abilities. The cognitive perspective would say we need to change how you think. There's a logical flaw somewhere in your mental setup that by talking about it, by going through exercises, we can get you to shift your thinking. And the sociocultural model says that obviously different cultures have different impact on how we think of ourselves. I mean, in the United States, in today's climate, we have situations that lend themselves to the future not being extremely predictable. So the fact that people respond apprehensively, or anxiously, that's not hard to figure out. So that will be the social cultural explanation. So here's a handy dandy little mnemonic device. We have Bob can see a perky hippo. Okay, so BBCSPH, if you go back here, you'll see that that actually then lets you remember. So again, biological, okay, there's something wrong with your, and there's the whole list, brain, neurons, nervous system, etc. And we can treat that. Again, we're going to look at all of this throughout the school year. Evolutionary perspective, okay, this is where we start to base decisions on the fact that we want to survive. Genetics, okay, this is where we look at the code you come in with, and is there something we can do about that as we get into CRISPR and sequencing, genetic sequencing. We can start to look at things apparently now that let you basically manipulate this code and therefore have different playouts in your life. Psychodynamic, something happened to you pretty early in childhood and that's causing you to have issues down the road. Humanism, you see on the right the graph that says self-actualization at the top, but there's a whole lot of work on the bottom you have to do first. Positive psychology, it's a wonderful way to look at the world, right? In other words, whatever you are today, it can be better tomorrow. And even if everything's going great, it can still get better, right? So that's positive psychology. Behaviorism, something is coming from the environment. Cognitive, your thinking process. And social cultural, here something's going on in your environment, and you can certainly, even if you moved, you could have certain changes in how we look at the world and how we unfold. But again, as I showed you earlier with the biopsychosocial model, where there are 3 overlapping circles in that Venn diagram, quite often it's not just one story. It could be several of these or quite a few of these that are at work at the same time. Quick history, the American Psychological Association, the APA, first president was G. Stanley Hall, first female president, Mary Whiton Calkins, and the first African American president was Kenneth B. Clark.